All right. So I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you for the invitation. Sorry I can't be there in person. I realize I'm the only thing now standing in the way to the closure and conclusion of a very fruitful and very substantive and stimulating 3-day conference. So I'll get right to it. So again, I think this as a last session, it was interesting that the sort of the credit rating agencies did come up. And so I think this follows very nicely with my colleagues' presentations preceding. So I will be presenting on the climate credit score, looking at how rating agencies channel market power to turn climate vulnerability into sovereign risk, and thereby foreclose the fiscal space, particularly national fiscal space for climate financing. So to start with, a political economy overview of the dominant credit rating agencies in the international financial architecture today, and to really position credit rating agencies as a systemic actor in the financial architecture as market movers and shapers. So the three dominant credit rating agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor, and Fitch, all headquartered in New York, control more than 94% of outstanding credit ratings. The purpose of rating agencies, ostensibly, is to act as a bridge between lenders and borrowers by reducing the information asymmetry through the provision of, quote unquote, said, objective, independent, and expert information on issuers or borrowers of bonds and other debt instruments and fixed income securities. That's sort of a market definition. A primary concern is the creditworthiness of the borrower nation, that is, the ability of a state or an enterprise to observe its obligations to said sovereign debt. The key channel of the material effect of rating agencies is precisely on the costs and terms of borrowing in international capital markets. So ratings issued to countries become de facto the ratings assigned to non-state borrowers of the same nationality as well. Analysis of the influence of rating agencies' issuances on investor behavior illustrates that ratings affect credit flows and yield levels disproportionately for global South countries, for developing countries overall. Precisely in that yields move in the direction of rating agency opinions and assessments to a degree that is statistically significant. And these are recorded in various studies going back to the early 80s. Rating agencies thus act as market movers and policy shapers in an international financial architecture characterized by currency hierarchy, capital count liberalization, a lack of monetary sovereignty for many or most developing countries, and in particular, a global bond market bifurcated between high-yield bond assets in the developing countries and safe haven assets in the key financial centers and reserve currency issuers. So there exist various observations and critiques on rating agencies, a few of which are relevant to, just provide, there isn't a scope here for an extensive review of critiques, but I think some of the key critiques, I'll focus on three, is the monopoly formation of the rating agencies, in that the sheer lack of competition, the sheer lack of transparency, to a conflict of interest that is systematically generated by the issuer pays model, where rating agencies deliver judgments to the very financial clients who pay them for assessments, raising questions over the objectivity, motives, and legitimacy of the ratings methodology. So ratings generate a sort of universal language, very much rooted in the epistemic foundations and assumptions of neoclassical economics, in particular balanced government budgets and low inflation levels. Since the late 70s, a discernible effect on developing countries is the adoption of policies that address the short-term concerns and horizons of portfolio investors, even when they are in direct conflict with long-term national development needs and goals, including that which have been legislated on. In particular, to highlight that fiscal discipline is consistently reinforced by ratings, particularly during inflections of crises. Policy measures endorsing an austerity bias are viewed as credit positive, and conversely, spending measures to facilitate economic and social recovery, such as by stimulus and public expenditure, are assessed as credit negative. In turn, the effect is that fiscal discipline is rendered into a signal to capital markets that a government is willing to repay its debt obligations, creating a pro-cyclical dynamic that has been called the downgrade austerity vicious circle. And this, I will draw on how this connects to the climate debt vicious cycle. During the COVID pandemic in particular, rating agencies downgraded numerous developing countries, or at least placed them on a negative watch, signaling, in the words of the Financial Times in June 2020, that spending what is needed on pandemic stimulus could well invite ratings downgrades. And we all recall how even participating in the debt services suspension initiative of the G20 was deterred by the fear of rating downgrades. So this is very much in effect during these inflections of crises and has implication for the ongoing climate emergency, which will only intensify. A couple of years before even the pandemic, there was a quote by the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who said, quote unquote, austerity measures are adopted in order to send a very important signal of fiscal credibility. So this sort of aligns to, how rating agencies, in terms of the discourse in their reports, align quite symmetrically to IMF surveillance as well as loan conditions. And this is a long-standing phenomenon, whether from monetary tightening to the subsidy elimination and reductions in food and fuel that was earlier talked about in the context of the Green New Deal, the bias against public expenditure that colleagues Isabel and Emma all talked about, and the overall, template is quite symmetrical. So the point here is that it's not just the IMF, it is very much also the rating agencies that may, in fact, play a more powerful role in driving the austerity bias and fiscal and monetary tightening that systemically constrains fiscal space on a continual basis. So in this sense, the IMF conditions and recommendations can be seen as undergirded by rating agencies, while also then channeling the more aggressive logics of private finance, short-termism, deep risk aversion, bias against the developmental state, inter alia. So, the composition of sovereign credit risk then is visibly embedded within, and then with the conflict of interest, funded by and accountable to markets. So it is sort of a triple fold of the imbalancing and the accountability being quite symmetrical to the source of the financing. Consequently, it is of no surprise that rating agencies are pressured to promote the policies that maximize client profits and market shares, as has been documented in various studies, including UNCTAD's 2021 study. The absence of impartiality, objectivity, and fairness in the process and practice of rating agencies have been grounds for critics, as well as the UN independent expert on foreign debt and human rights, to highlight their undemocratic nature by even the most basic standards. So in essence, I would argue that the influence wielded by rating agencies creates a supranational and unaccountable governance mechanism by markets over states. And so this brings the focus directly to the climate credit score and how this context is necessary then to then look at how rating agencies are building since 2014, so still relatively new relative to the many, many decades of rating agency practice. They're still building the conceptual framework of their climate credit score. Now, the climate credit score sits firmly at the epicenter of the conceptual framework of the vicious cycle of climate and debt, right? Which essentially points to the recursive effects of climate shocks and debt distress in a context. Particularly, the key point of this context is the fact that we all know that approximately 70% of climate financing is channeled through debt creating loans, oftentimes conditional, very much in diametric opposition to the long-standing call for unconditional and debt-free grants, particularly for loss and damage financing, and in alignment to the UNFCCC principles, for equity and common but differentiated responsibility. So this is the conceptual framework. This is where the climate credit score really comes into play by adding a sharp spoke in this cycle. Like if we see this vicious cycle, then the sharpest spoke is this reality that climate vulnerabilities have since 2014 become an increasing debt risk in sovereign ratings. According to, the Global Risks Report 2022, climate risks now top the list. They're actually number one on just the list of the top 10 global risks for both short, medium, and long term. So there's no denying that it is being seen as the red hot risk. So from the Financial Stability Board to the European Central Bank, climate factors into financial risk management systems, as well as monetary policy frameworks by central banks increasingly, which I will not have the scope to address here, but it's an important point. To just highlight how recent these developments are, it was only while Moody's and Fitch Ratings have been working on developing their framework of assessing climate risks, starting in 2014, publishing seminal reports in 2016, 17, 18. It was actually only in 2020 where Fitch Ratings publicly stated that climate change will have an adverse impact on sovereign ratings, and that this is now established, from the top level. So, this sort of public statement is only as recent as 2020. So, the question is, how adverse is this impact? So according to a key study by the UN Environment Programme, UNEP, exposure to climate risks has already increased the cost of debt for vulnerable 20 group of systemically climate vulnerable countries by 117 basis points on average, which in other words translates to more than 40 billion in additional interest payments over the past 10 years on government debt alone. So on public debt, not just private debt. Now, if private debt is included, the vulnerable 20 economies are paying 62 billion in higher interest payments. So that's an increase from 40 to 62 billion. The projections made by the researchers in this particular study sets the additional cost over the next decade between 2021 and 2031. The study was published in 2021. So until 2031, the additional costs would be between 146 to 168 billion. Another key report by the Asian Development Bank, 427, and other groups, including World Wildlife Fund Singapore, that concludes that premia on sovereign bond yields amount to around 275 basis points for developing economies highly exposed to climate risk. So approximately 275 basis points. These costs are above and beyond the rates attributable to macroeconomic and fiscal fundamentals alone. So there is a, really discernible incremental debt yield that carries over then also into the cost of private debt. So the key finding then across a range of recent studies since 2021, if to sum up the group of these studies, is precisely that exposure to climate risks is statistically significant for developing countries, but not so for the sample groups of rich countries. So in other words, the translation of climate risk into sovereign credit risk is an exclusively developing country phenomenon. And that, I think, is a very important point in terms of how disproportionate, it's not just disproportionate, it's almost exclusive impacts. So I also want to mention an important study by the IMF, actually, ironically titled, This Changes Everything. This is a 2020 paper analyzing the effects of climate change on sovereign risk through government bond yields and spreads in a sample of 116 countries from 1995 to 2017, finding that an increase of 10 percentage points in climate vulnerability is associated with an increase of over 150 basis points in long-term government bond spreads of emerging markets and developing economies. On the other hand, an improvement of 10 percentage points in climate resilience is associated with a decrease of 37.5 basis points in bond spreads. In other words, a vulnerability hurts far more than resilience pays off. An academic study by Sun and Shen in 2023, just last year, on the impact of climate vulnerability versus climate resilience or readiness on the sovereign ratings of 117 countries finds that countries with speculative credit ratings exhibit high vulnerability and lower social resilience concerning climate, whereas countries with investment grade ratings demonstrate greater resilience. So this is not surprising, but with many, although not all, developing countries falling within the speculative grading parameters, this correlation underscores how fiscal instability and heightened climate vulnerability contribute to the credit ratings assigned by rating agencies, directly influencing a country's ability to mitigate their economic and climate-related risks. So consequently, this impedes efforts to also reduce both economic and climate vulnerability on the global scale, and the pressure on climate vulnerable countries from the rating agencies is inherently to invest more in mitigation rather than adaptation. So I wanted to give a very quick overview of the methodology that is outlined in a 2018 paper by Standard & Poor's, as well as another paper by Moody's. Both of their methodologies corroborate, so I think that's one point. Both the methodologies state that climate risks are now integrated into the 4 key risk factors used in sovereign risk analysis. They highlight essentially 4 key areas as channels through which sovereign credit profiles are translated. So 1 is economic impact, 2, damage to infrastructure assets, 3, social costs, health crisis, food security, and 4, population shifts such as displacements resulting from climate change. So we see the sort of whole gamut of the structure of sort of the penalization. In a 2016 report on assessing climate change for sovereigns, Moody's concludes that sovereign ratings are increasingly and strongly correlated with their susceptibility to climate change. And Moody's also admits to making explicit downward adjustments to account for sovereigns' vulnerability to climate change. In other words, downgrades are made preemptively, regardless of the actual event of a climate disaster. The examples in Moody's report include the sort of preemptive downgrade rating is for small island nations, agriculture-based or weather-sensitive economies, and tourism-based economies. So there we have a sizable number of developing countries. In the same report, the methodology details that 2 primary measures of climate vulnerability will be the issuer's exposure and resilience to climate change. So exposure to climate change is then a function of a national economic diversification, geographic location. Resilience is a function of adaptive capacity, fiscal flexibility, as well as countries' income and development levels. So, one thing that's immediately discernible is that while geographic location is beyond a nation's control, aspects such as economic diversification and fiscal flexibility far from being 100% sovereign aspects, they're duly handicapped by a range of international constraints, from trade and investment agreements to loan conditions. There is an immediate sense of the absence of sovereignty in how sovereign agency and how the rating agencies are defining the risk and resilience, exposure and resilience. According to Moody's, a quote is a common characteristic among the most susceptible sovereigns is their economic reliance on the agricultural sector, which is typically not irrigated and is thus rain-fed. So, we see how agriculture is specifically pinpointed. So this is, I think, the slide where that shows the economic diversification and the exposure and resilience framework. This is also a chart that shows how rating agencies assess the movement of vulnerability versus resilience. And you can see from 2010 that, vulnerabilities shoot up and resilience, which they call readiness, interestingly, they don't call it resilience, they call it readiness, starts going incrementally downwards. A few quick country examples, just a snapshot since there's not time to go within.
Sorry to interrupt you, Bhumika. Could you begin to wind up?
Yeah,
quickly?
yeah. I'll just skip over the country examples. It's just looking at how the floods in Pakistan in particular, Fitch Ratings downgraded Pakistan's rating from B- to CCC+, in the context of 9 million people pushed below the poverty line, high food insecurity, inflation, foreign external debt. There were also key examples from Namibia and St. Martin. Namibia was one of years-long drought, and St. Martin was the famous Hurricane Irma. So, in wrapping up, just a conclusion and ways forward, the sort of foreclosure of the kind of fiscal and monetary policy space required for sustainable national and international climate finance is very much in jeopardy with the framework of the ratings. While unsurprising vis-a-vis market logics, one of the key issues is that the sort of fiscal rule books, the fiscal and monetary norms that are applied by rating agencies are by and large arbitrary, oftentimes with no evidence and no basis, and yet one size fits all applied to developing countries, while at the same time, when developed countries routinely, consistently don't follow any of these norms, particularly in times of crises, it's not an issue. So one of the key points is that in turning climate vulnerability into sovereign risk, and this sort of weaponization that's sort of taking place by rating agencies, it's not just the exacerbation of debt distress, but it's the fact that the very states that bear the historical and systemic climate injustice, instead of reparations, instead of climate justice, there's a sharp danger of not only reproducing, but also intensifying debt distress. And ultimately, the question is the erosion of economic sovereignty as a chronic effect of an equally intensifying climate crisis. So it really points to the ways in which economic sovereignty and climate crisis are being, correlated in this diametric reversal of the ethos of climate reparations, where the effect of market logics is to penalize rather than pay dues of climate debt. So in effect, the market function subverts the existing principles of the Paris Agreement: equity, common but differentiated responsibilities, polluter pays, and means of implementations. So the ways forward, UNCTAD as well as ECLAC for many years, but particularly in a 2023 paper, have proposed a multilateral credit rating agencies that could create new approaches for assessing sovereign credit worthiness for both developing and developed economies, particularly to work out resolutions in a way that the SDGs can be actioned during an ecological transition. Their paper lays out the functions of such a multilateral mechanism, engagement of stakeholders, how the institutional design would be structurally different from the
Bhumika, could you
I can wrap up there. Yeah. And just
thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much.